Okay, so again, this is going to be for, I shouldn't say again, but this is exam 4. We're doing the review, chapters 34 through 36 and chapter 33. So 33 through 34, that would be the monetary policy, taking on such things as dealings with the Federal Reserve, et cetera. Anyway, chapter 33 would be with, has to do with fiscal policy. So anyway, onward we go. So when we talk about money, M1 money in particular, and I'll be talking about definitionally, this is again for the review, but definitionally, this is like in the world where the normal world, and we're not living in a normal world so far as so far as M1 money is concerned, because the normal world for M1 money would include such things as what? Would include currency and checkable deposits, or demand deposits and other checkable deposits, which are basically checks, but demand deposits are specifically where you're not getting any, you're not getting any, drawing any interest on the checking account, whereas the other checkable deposits would include such things as NOW accounts, negotiable orders, withdrawals, share drafts at credit unions, where there is a very, very small, slight amount of interest that would be associated with it. Anyway, back to our M1 money. So this, the definition has changed. We'll walk through that as if you will. But to start with, we kind of fix the screen. There we go. Make it a little bit larger too, so that we're just looking at this. So M1 money, medium of exchange. This is the first thing we're looking at, the criteria in order to meet that M1 money, that source of funding, if you will, that's so liquid that we call it money. M1 money, first was medium of exchange, meaning that it would be acceptable for purchase of goods and services, right? So we're using that as a medium of exchange, whether we're talking about hard currency or fiat currency, where it's dictated by government. A dollar is a dollar because the government says a dollar is a dollar. Medium of exchange, second would be unit of account. That would mean the, for example, like the price per pound or the price per gallon for gasoline, for example, using, the buying those goods and services, but how much would you actually be buying? Lastly would be a store of value, which speaks more directly to this liquidity. So when we talk about liquidity, what that means is that we have a reasonable idea of how much something is worth, and we know that it's something that will retain its value kind of going forward. More specifically, so an example would be, I'm holding a dollar bill in front of me. That dollar bill is worth $1 today, and tomorrow it's still going to be worth $1 nominally, of course, but basically it's unchanged. So it's a store of value. So we know what that's going to be worth going forward. Fiat money versus hard currency was as I just described, and that being that fiat money is that it's something that's declared by government to be worth X amount. This is what it's worth. That's why it fits this criteria for a medium of exchange, unit of account, and or store of value. Hard currency, it's backed up by something else, representing something else, representing gold, silver, some other type of a commodity. Typically, that's the hard currency. So example of M1 money would have been, again, this is in the past, if you will. M1 money would be $3.7 trillion. Of that, $1.5 trillion in currency, and the others in those demand deposits or other checkable deposits of $2.1 trillion. M2, we're looking at our representation down below here. M2 includes this M1 money that we just described, at 3.7 trillion, plus the non-M1 component of M2. And that amounted to that $10.6 trillion, the amount down here. The two together would, of course, constitute M2, that total being that, what is it, $14.3 trillion in toto, right? Anyway, that's M1, M2. The idea, of course, is M1 is very, very liquid. M2 is not so liquid, meaning that in order for you to have a transaction, you have to move your money from M2, the non-M1 component of M2, to M1. That's the difference. So it's a little less liquid, if you will, M2 money or non-M1 component of M2. Anyways, I'm speaking in circles. You get the idea. So the actual creation of credit, what we're talking about is creating M1 money. M1 money, typically when we talk about creating money, we think of such things as running the printing presses. So we're talking about this currency piece up here, this 1.5 trillion in currency, but the largest burden of the economy actually falls on, or the larger burden falls upon those checkable deposits. Bearing in mind, back up here with this $1.5 trillion in currency, 2/3 of that amount is actually outside the country. So really what we're talking about is only $500 billion in this case, actually working, being out there in the economy. So the printing presses, yes, they're running, and yes, they play a major role because they're counted as M1 money, but that's not where the bulk of M1 money actually resides. Most of it is in those demand deposits or those checkable deposits. So when we talk about the creation of M1 money, that has to do more so rather than with currency, with the printing press, but more with those demand deposits or other checkable deposits. So this is where we get back to when we talk about our DBU and our SBU. I don't have it on here, but our financial intermediaries are the ones that come between and marry the two together. They bring SBU and the DBU together that goes through the financial intermediary. More specifically, the financial intermediary that we're talking about are depositories. Depositories consist of commercial banks, credit unions, savings banks, and savings and loans. They have a very, very specific purpose because when the financial intermediaries, what they do, their role in terms of, again, that circular flow of financial activity is bringing the surplus budget units together with the deficit budget units. Their role is, again, bringing those two together, and they can increase the velocity of M1 money through transactions. So the quicker it gets through the system, that's the velocity, how quickly that M1 money makes its way through the system. And we speak to the velocity of M1 money as in how quickly that you take the GDP and divide it by the quantity of M1 money, and that tells you how rapidly the economy is actually growing, because GDP, gross domestic product, those are the sales of the final goods and services, right? The retail value, the price, if you will, that's out there. And that, of course, and if you want to buy anything, you have to use what? M1 money. That's the velocity of M1 money. It's a relationship to that GDP, how quickly it works its way through the GDP, how quickly those transactions occur. So it increases the velocity of M1 money. The financial intermediaries being depositories, contractuals, and the like, all the different financial intermediaries that we spoke about. and so that's the velocity, but the depositories, they're the only ones, the depositories, the banks, the credit unions, savings banks, and savings and loans, they're the only ones that can increase the quantity of M1 money. So they can increase the velocity plus the quantity of M1 money. Okay, anyhow, so when we talk about the increase in the quantity of M1 money, this is through the lending process. This is their role. This is why when we talk about depositories, banks, we think of a bank as being very, very stodgy, very, very cautious. And if you've ever had to get a loan from a bank, through a bank, you'll know exactly what I mean. Loan for a car, loan for a mortgage, for a home, along those lines. They pick apart your financial history with a very, very much a fine-tooth comb. They're just unbelievable. They're unrelenting, if you will. So anyhow, so in their role as depositories and their role in increasing the velocity of M1 money, here's an example. Borrower wants to, so you're a firm, you're an entrepreneur firm. You want to borrow. You want to borrow. You would need a loan of $1 million to meet payroll for the next 90 days or whatever. for your working capital, if you will. So what happens is that this is kind of what comes out the other end. Your checkable deposit is created in the borrower's account. First off, the borrower is approved, right? The bank has to go through the financial records of that borrower to make sure they're a good risk, et cetera. And the bank itself, so the borrower wants $1 million, the bank has to have a certain amount on reserve. In normal circumstances, it's been about 10% on reserve, meaning that in order to create a loan of $1 million, the bank has to have $100,000 in reserve. Granted, right at the moment, the reserve requirement is 0%, but we'll just stick with this 10% for our purposes. So the bank has to have 10% on deposit and reserves, either having vault cash as an on hand in the bank or in the financial institution in the depository, or on deposit at the Fed being the Federal Reserve System, right? So the takeaway is that with this $100,000 on reserve, the bank has created what? A $1 million loan in the favor of the borrower. So the borrower has $1 million in their checking account, right? And so this is a loan. You're lending money to that borrower. So this is actually what? Considered an asset. A loan is considered an asset for the bank. All right, so it's a good guy for the bank because it's a working asset, meaning that there's interest that's derived from that loan, which is, again, the rationale behind this. I have to be very, very careful. I'll be very straightforward with this, and that is that banks, the reason that they're so stodgy, the reason that they're so darn particular, really is because they've got a huge amount of risk that they're bearing. Because what happens is that if they create a loan, excuse me, they lend $1 million to a firm, to a person, what have you. If that firm does not pay that $1 million, the bank is on the hook for that entire $1 million. Of course, less the $100,000. So really, they've already got that out there, but they're on the hook for the total $1 million loss. So they have to be extremely, extremely careful. So again, the takeaway is that M1 is created in the form of that checkable deposit. And of course, the bank, the borrower writes checks on that loan to its employees, to meet payroll and so on and so forth. And that gets right back out into the community. This is where it's growing, and it's moving very, very rapidly through the economy. So Monetary Policy Authority is the Federal Reserve System, and the Federal Reserve System consists of the Federal Reserve itself, which is housed in Washington, D.C., the Board of Governors and the chair of the Fed, and also the federal district banks, the Federal Reserve district banks. We'll get to that in a second. So that's they're the Monetary Policy Authority. They're the only ones in the country, which has not always been the case, but that is the case right now. The monetary policy is run through the Fed or the Federal Reserve. And I refer to it as the Fed, kind of capital letters, just to kind of separate it or to distinguish it. Fiscal policy is legislature. That's through, at the federal level is Congress, so Senate and or the House and the Senate, state legislatures, so the state bodies that are out there, and other local governing bodies, whether we're talking about county or city or township or what have you. So they're the ones that are the fiscal authority. The monetary policy has to deal with interest rates and where things are going so far as those interest rates are concerned. And specifically, and the fiscal, they're the taxing authority. They're the people that make decisions on spending bills and expenditures at whatever level you're talking about, federal, state, or local. So again, the Federal Reserve System is what dictates that monetary policy, and their mandate is their macro mandate. They have others, but this is specifically has to do with the macro side in terms of monitoring price level changes, trying to maximize employment and maximize the economic growth. So they have all kinds of competing interests, but that's kind of their directive, if you will, their prime directive to manage that macro economy as best they can from their monetary policy roles. Okay, so when we talk about monetary policy at the Fed, that's directed by the FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee, and they participate in what are called market operations. They're not the only ones, but we'll get to what that means in a moment. So there are 7 governors housed in Washington, D.C., including the Fed chair, who's currently Jerome Powell. Plus, again, this is the FOMC, 5 of the Federal Reserve district bank presidents. New York has a permanent seat. Reason being, of course, that New York is kind of considered the center of the financial universe in the U.S. It's increasingly changed over years, but in the past, that's been the case. And so there are 5 total bank presidents. New York has 1. So the 4 of the remaining seats are filled by 11 by the other 11 other federal district banks, the bank presidents, and on a rotating basis. So anyways, there are 12 altogether, including New York. So number 1 would be Boston, New York, and I'm not going to go through the whole list. You've got those. And it would include Detroit, I should say, Michigan and Indiana, I believe, for the most part, are part of the Bank of Chicago, except for the UP, and Michigan, I think, is covered by Minneapolis. Anyway, all the federal district bank presidents have a say in the policy. So they meet every 6 weeks, the FOMC, and all the presidents are invited to join in and partake, et cetera, but only 5 can actually vote. Voting on monetary policy is driving the Fed funds rate up or down or keeping it static. So when we talk about the Fed funds, that would be open market operations. All right. What I mean by that is that these are the interest rates that are charged by member banks. This is the market that's out there for interest that is charged by member banks when they borrow and lend amongst each other. So the member depositories that fall under the category of under the auspices, under the direction of the Fed itself, right? So that's pretty much all of our depositories. So the banks, credit unions, et cetera, fall kind of under that category. What the Fed does do, the Fed being the FOMC, they set the targeted Fed funds rate. They don't set the rate, they don't set the Fed funds rate, they set the targeted Fed funds rate. So what that means is that, let's just say, we'll give an example. So you want a restrictive account, you have 3 choices, I guess: static, or restrictive, or accommodative policy. So with the restrictive policy, what we're saying is that we want interest rates to go up. And the reason we want interest rates to go up in this case, because of inflation, for example. There might be a lot of inflation, and so our directive for our monetary policies, we want to, our prescription is to drive up interest rates. So the Fed in the FOMC back up here, they decide to raise interest by 1%, or what's called 100 basis points. 1 basis point represents 1% of 1%, right? So 100 basis points would be 100% of 1%, or 1%. So we direct the Fed of New York. They're the ones that are tasked with driving the market toward those targeted rates. So basically what they do is that if they want to drive up interest rates, it would be selling securities. The securities we mean by US Treasury securities for the most part. Or if they want to drive down interest rates, they would want to, toward whatever that target is. If it's the target is lower, then we want to drive down interest rates, we would buy Treasury securities. And the reason that happens, we'll walk through in a moment, but we'll just highlight this: accommodative monetary policy. New York Fed buys Treasury security bills, notes, or bonds, if you will, depending upon the maturity. So here's our example. So in this case, New York Fed writes a check to us. They're buying securities to bond dealers, and the bond dealers. So there are specific dealers that are out there that they operate with the Fed. It's a really lucrative contract too, because it's guaranteed profit because you're getting commissions. So you're a bond dealer And in this case, we're selling, the Fed is buying Treasury securities. So we'll just say they're buying $1 trillion worth of Treasury securities. Treasury securities meaning either bills, notes, or bonds. So they're buying these Treasury securities, and their objective is to drive up interest rates by 1%, we'll say, or excuse me, to lower interest rates by 1%. You'll get my drift in a moment. Just keep thinking supply and demand. So the Fed writes a check to the bond dealer for $1 trillion, and the bond dealer turns over that Treasury security to the Fed. Fed holds that Treasury security, throws it in the drawer, and it's socked away. The bond dealer takes the $1 trillion, and what do they do with it? They deposit it into the system. And when they deposit it in the system, that increases the overall reserves in the system. And again, increasing the overall reserves in the system. Very, very important to understand. So this is the accommodative policy. Restrictive policy would be the other way around. The New York Fed sells, they're selling US Treasuries. So in this case, that bond dealer writes a check to the Fed for the $1 trillion, right? They want to drive interest rates up by 1%. And so the Fed takes it's selling the Treasury security back to that bond dealer. So the bond dealer writes a check to the Fed for $1 trillion. The Fed takes that check and tears it up, doesn't do anything with it, throws it away, doesn't matter. It has no meaning to them whatsoever. And what that does is it reduces the overall reserves in the system. Okay, this is one of these things you've kind of walked through a few times before you kind of get your head wrapped around it. So what the Fed does on an administrative level is that they set this targeted rate up here. They set the targeted Fed funds rate, but they set the discount window rate, and they also set the legal required reserve rate. So the discount window is a place where if you are if you're part of the Federal Reserve System, if you will, if you are a member bank or if you're a member depository, you can borrow and lend Treasury securities, federal funds from the other respective banks. Typically, these are like overnight loans. And anyways, without getting into too much detail, you're borrowing and lending amongst each other. If your credit is so bad that your fellow banks or your fellow depositories really can't trust you, you have no choice but to, if you want to create more loans, if you want to kind of stay in business, you have to go directly to the Fed. And that's the Fed discount window. That's a place where you don't want to go, because when you go to the discount window, you become like every other person who wants to borrow anything from a bank. You come under the scrutiny of the Fed even more so than you otherwise would be the case. And so this is you don't want to go to that. But nonetheless, when times are really tough, like in terms of like a 9/11 or with COVID, the Fed opens up its discount window and lends reserves like crazy, or it has done so in the past, but it's rare that they do that. The other piece of this is that legal, the required reserve rate or required legal reserve rate. And recent history, it's been about 10%. Now it's at 0, but the Fed dictates how much you have to have on deposit. So if you create that loan for $1 million, it means that you have to have $100,000 on reserve, either on deposit in terms of vault cash or on deposit at the Fed. So this is kind of a real simple math piece right here. You take total legal reserves. Legal is important. It's just a point, but it's important. Those would be like US Treasury securities, for example. So your total legal reserves minus your required legal reserves equals your excess legal reserves. Very simple, very straightforward. So if you have a lot of excess legal reserves, what can you do with them? You can lend them to other member banks, et cetera. So it's very, very straightforward. So again, this Fed funds market is where you would lend those excess legal reserves. Or if you have a shortfall of the reserves, you got a shortage of reserves, you could borrow from your other member fellow banks that are out there or depositories. So without Fed involvement in buying or selling in terms of monetary policy, the total amount of reserves did not change. So if it's just the banks, the depositories trading with each other, it doesn't change the overall reserves, the amount of reserves in the system. But it's when the Fed actually acts, goes out there through the Fed of New York to buy and sell Treasury securities, for example, that's when we have a change in the overall amount of reserves that are in the system. Onward. Interest rates. Interest rates are just very straightforward. They're the price or the future value of money, really, okay? And so what we have is what's called the inverse relationship, and the interest rate goes up, the price value of security, and this is the critical piece, the pre-existing bonds, the price actually goes down if the interest rates go up. What this means is this, just here's an example. I won't go into the equity side, which are stocks, but it does behave very similar way, and I'll just leave it at that. But when we're talking about debt instruments, we're looking at existing bonds. So we're focusing on those bonds. So I have a bond from General Motors. I bought a $10,000 bond from General Motors, meaning that I'm lending General Motors $10,000. And on the bond, it says it's going to be out there for 10 years to maturity. And I'm getting 10% annual rate of return on that bond. Sounds good. Actually, it does sound good. But getting 10% rate of return on that bond. And so I'm holding on to this bond, and I'm into it for 1 year. So now it's going to mature. It's going to it's going to time out, if you will, and I'll get the interest, all of my interest back and all of my principal back over the course of the next 10 years. So I'm into it 1 year, so there's 9 years left. And what's happened over the course of this last year is that interest rates have gone up 5% because of inflation, whatever. So interest rates have gone up 5%. And so now General Motors is issuing new bonds, and those new bonds are being issued at 15% rate of return. So I've got my bond that getting 10%, and the new issue bonds are at 15%. If you're looking at them together, comparing apples to apples, my bond is going to be worth what? Worth less than the new bond, because the new bond is paying 15%. Anyway, and the last thing to kind of keep note here is that bonds, and just like stocks, are bought and sold, and they're marketable is the term. Onward we go. So I'm not going to be too much longer, actually, so this is good. So liquidity preference theory was something that was put together, ginned up by John Maynard Keynes, very, very famous economist. The demand side, anyways, we'll get into a little bit of Keynes as we go forward, especially when we talk about fiscal policy. But so far as monetary policy is concerned, he put forward the policy of, again, we're looking at the supply and demand for M1 money, meaning we're focusing, strictly speaking, on the demand, as opposed to what was called the loanable funds. Loanable funds is just the supply and demand of credit overall. Whereas when we're talking about M1 money, we're looking at it in terms of, it's kind of this liquidity piece of it, meaning specifically we're looking at it in terms of transactions. Remember the transactions, that medium of exchange, the unit of account, and we're also looking at that last piece as a store of value, as an asset. So this is part 1 and 2 up above: transactions, demand, medium of exchange, and unit of account. And part 3 down below is that asset demand as a store of value. So what we're saying is that so far as transactions demands are concerned, when we have the quantity demanded of M1 money on the y-axis, and we've got GDP or economic growth on the x-axis, the faster the economy grows, the steeper, or the more that demand for the more it increases the quantity demanded of M1 money. For what? Transactional purposes. Because remember, we talk about the velocity of M1 money, we take the GDP divided by the actual M1 money that's out there, and the more GDP that you have, the quicker that M1 money is working its way through the system. It increases the M1 money for transactions demands purposes. That's it, straightforward. So anyhow, so if this is just as an aside, but if the Fed wants to slow down the economy by driving up interest rates, that's going to cause us to pull back, because as an entrepreneur, where do we like our interest rates? We like them low. We don't like them rising. We like them falling, if anything, or staying static. At least we know what the environment is, but we would prefer that our interest rates are low. We don't want them rising. The interest rates go up, we would pull back on our actual borrowing. Because remember, when we talk about growing our businesses, we prefer to use what? Other people's money, borrowing. Okay, this is standard operating procedure. So the other part of this liquidity preference theory has to do with the M1 money as a store of value. So what that means is that, again, looking at it from the asset demand perspective, interest rates are on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and this time we're looking at quantity demanded of M1 money not being on the vertical axis or the x-axis or the y-axis, but on the horizontal or the x-axis. So in this case, we're saying that as asset demand, as interest rates go up. So as interest rates go up, the quantity demanded of money for asset demand goes down. We'll just say assets. I wanted to put AD in there, but that's aggregate demand. So asset demand goes down, right? And that's pretty straightforward, meaning that, think about it this way, think about it in terms of opportunity cost. So if inflation is at 5%, or let's just say it's at 0%, there's not much of a need to move your money from its very liquid state as M1 money, because you're not losing much. There's not much opportunity cost associated with it. And what I mean by that, of course, is that when the interest rates are, so for example, inflation is very low, interest rates are very, very low, it doesn't cost you much, because remember, how much interest are you actually earning on your M1 money? 0 for sure on currency. But you can tag, if you look at demand deposits, checkable deposits, you're not getting much interest, if anything, on those either, really. So what we're saying is that when interest rates are low, the opportunity cost of holding onto M1 money is very low. But as interest rates rise, that opportunity cost gets higher and higher. So we're more likely to do what? Move from M1 money to M2 money and to other types of investment vehicles that are far less liquid. So anyhow, we got that. So we're looking at transaction purposes, or we're looking at transactions demand or asset demand. So the liberal approach on these are just kind of general terms as we walk through. So the liberal approach is that, so far as the fiscal policy is concerned, higher taxes in general, increased government spending, so increased government involvement. And we're saying it's more of a demand side problem, or demand side issue, meaning that we're back to our backward bending supply curve of labor that holds sway. And what that means is that when we used our example of the backward bending supply curve of labor, when tax cuts, we use tax cuts as like the kind of the fallback on increased wages. What I mean by that is, remember, when we talk about our income, it goes to 3 places. It goes to taxes, goes to consumption, goes to saving. So the point being, again, when we talk about this backward bending supply curve for labor, if we have the idea, of course, is that if we have more income, if all else equal, we would be, if we have a tax cut, we're paying less in taxes, and more money is out there available for consumption or for saving. So the objection to tax cuts is that, just as it is with the supply curve, the backward bending supply curve of labor, is that yes, it slopes upward to the right initially when we're looking at the wage rate and the quantity labor supplied, if you will. This is the labor supplied, actually. So labor supplied increases move sloping upward to the right, But then it bends back on itself with the higher wages, because what happens is that we reach that point where, remember, we have our day is divided up into two categories. Our 24-hour day is divided up into leisure and work. Leisure is a normal good. Normal goods say what? When we talk about normal goods, the more income that we have, the more leisure that we want, the more normal goods that we want. So the more income, this is a trade-off. In order to achieve that, we have to work more. But there's a point at which where we have these diminishing returns, meaning that if the wage rate continues to rise as such, we can go back, it bends back on itself because we would actually supply less labor. This would be 40 hours, this would be 60 hours, and that would be 80 hours. The wage rate goes up, but rather than working these 80 hours out here, we actually pull back and we end up making about the same overall income, if you will, by working fewer hours. So we're saying that tax cuts don't work because people will, rather than supply more labor, they will pull back on the labor. So this is the demand approach, demand side approach, or if you will, or the liberal kind of approach to this. So kind of in summary, tax cuts, higher wages, reduced labor supplied, reduced taxes collected, and higher and persistent deficits. Persistent is important. Higher deficits initially, but they would continue on kind of going forward, as opposed to the conservative approach. The conservative approach is probably the more rational approach. I'm not just saying it from a political perspective, but from realistic perspective. What they're saying is that this backward bending supply curve doesn't really fit into this context. So what we're saying is we're lowering taxes. We're actually just lowering the tax rates. Remember our marginal rates. The more we're working, the higher the rates. So if we can reduce our marginal rates, meaning there will be what? More income. So we would say with lower taxes, lower tax rates, we're reducing government spending, hopefully. Otherwise, what'll happen is we'll end up with what? We will end up with increased deficits, right? But anyway, but this doesn't really hold the reduced government spending, and nonetheless, regardless, you would have higher disposable income. Your income goes to what? Taxes, consumption, and saving. All else equal, ceteris paribus. If we reduce our taxes, more goes to where? Income. More flows into income and or saving. We say that the aggregate demand shifts rightward because of that increased income that we have out there. And what are we going to do with that increased income? We're going to spend it, consume it. And even though there's always an argument about, no, the wealthy people are not going to be spending it, they're going to be salting it away and saving. The reality is that most, even the higher income people, they end up using that income. We'll leave it at that. Anyway, so that's the supply side argument, which goes along with that conservative approach, saying that the tax cuts, higher wages, increased labor supplied. So if you're going to be working more, if you're going to be having more of your take-home pay taken home, less going off in taxes, you're going to be supplying more labor. As the result of which, down the road, keep this in mind, increased taxes collected. This is true. This is actually what happened. Hi, you guys. Oh, I forgot you got a class coming. Okay, I'm gonna have to cut it short there, and I will get back to this in a bit. Hi, guys. You're fine. I was doing a recording.